Good morning. It is wonderful to be here. I am Delegate Carrie Coiner and excited to welcome you to the second meeting of Virginia's new Commission on Early Childhood Care and Education. On behalf of Secretary Gadara and myself, I'd like to welcome and thank you for participating in this important work. And it's nice to be here in person and not virtual as the last time. So thankful we can be in this space. Before we get started, I wanted to point out a few things. One, we have a packed agenda, so hopefully you already looked that over, and we need to stay as tight as possible on our timeline. So I'm going to count on everybody to help at their tables, be great timekeepers. Feel free to get up as you need to get water or coffee. I promised Delegate Bulova I'd make him an omelet for our next meeting. But today we do have water and coffee over here. Restrooms are right outside the door, so move around as you need to. We will do a quick break for everyone to grab lunch around 12 o'clock and then jump right back into our work. We promise to wrap up as close to 2 o'clock as possible. Everyone should have stacks of sticky notes in front of them. These are for you, just like at the last meeting, to continuously jot notes. I think some folks were a little shy to get started on using notes last time. So encourage your table mates. If you're a type A and you start first, encourage others around you to weigh in with their thoughts, their ideas as you listen to the panel discussion. So it's really important that we're active listeners and we're jotting down on notes, things that we hear from presentations that we can reflect later on. Staff will float on a frequent basis to pick up your sticky notes to ensure that they are incorporated into our collective insights from our time together today. We have a few commission members participating virtually. Members of our staff team are monitoring the Zoom. So for all of our Zoom participants, please leave your virtual sticky notes in the chat box, and staff will convert those to real sticky notes here in the room. So please participate just as you would in person. At this time, I'd like to take the roll. So as I call your name, if you would please reply here if you are in the room. If you are attending by Zoom, please reply here or a hand raise in the location from which you are joining. All right, Secretary Amy Gadara or her delegate Emily Gillickson. Secretary Brian Slater or his delegate Billy Reed. Thank you. Dr. Lisa Coons. Danny Avula. Senator Evan. Senator Locke. Senator Stanley. Senator Suderline. Delegate Bulova. Delegate Cherry. Delegate Hayes. Delegate Campbell. Delegate Coiner, I'm here. Ashley Allen. I saw Ashley. She must have just stepped out. I'm sure she'll be back, but she is here. Belinda Astrup. Ellie Bracey or her delegate Christy Somerville Midget. Jason Elkubi. I saw Jason. Simon Fiscus.
Here.
Thank you. Shakiba Frazier. Kathy Glazier. Edmund Hughes. Sonia Jones. Here. Kristen Kane. Todd Norris. Nicholas Palacio. Stacy Parham. Benita Petrella. John Saleh. Travis Staten. Gary Thompson. Stacy Vance. Kevin Waddles. Rachel Williams. And Elizabeth Winkle. All right, that's everybody. All right, so before we jump into today's content and hear from some amazing national experts on early childhood, I think it's important for ourselves here in this room and for the public to be reminded of our responsibility and charge of the commission. So as stated in the code, the Commission on Early Childhood, in recognition of the fact that early care and education of young children is linked to not only academic success, but also workforce readiness. The Commission on Childhood was established to provide recommendations for and tracking progress on the financing of a comprehensive birth to 5 early childhood care and education system. Our focus should be on ensuring that there is stable, high-quality early childhood care and education services for all families who need them the most, empower parents with choices that meet their needs and preferences, and that we support both school readiness and workforce participation. Simply put, our commission is charged with setting a vision and making recommendations for financing the early childhood care and education system and ensuring that it is one of high quality and accessible to all. So today, and we have a deadline, that's important, October 1st. So we have some work to do. So when I say use those sticky notes today, y'all, I mean use those sticky notes. We have work to do. So today we have the honor of hearing from 3 national experts. There are full bios in your packets, but in advance, I'd like to express appreciation to Elliot Regenstein of Foresight Law and Policy, Simon Workman of Prenatal to 5 Fiscal Strategies, and Daphna Bassick of the University of Virginia. Please note in your packets, we've provided with supplemental resources with thanks to the UVA Law Clinic and the Virginia Department of Education. At this time, I'd like to turn the podium over to Elliot to review his summary of our July meeting and provide an overview of how quality workforce and cost connect, intersect, and ultimately impact the experiences of children and families. Welcome, Elliot.
Thank you, Delegate / Chair, Co-Chair Coiner. It's an honor to be back and to summarize the work we did last time, and there was a lot of it. One of the first things we started with was identifying what are our core priorities for Virginia's early childhood system. And again, with the idea being that Virginia wants to have a best-in-class system, what is it going to take to make that happen? And there were a few priorities that really rose to the top. One is to keep a consistent focus on the experiences that children are having, right? That's absolutely at the core of this, is to make sure children have those great experiences that prepare them for success later in life. And also to make sure that families have choices. And by choices, people talked about the real choice means that families have options that they like, that are accessible to them, that are affordable, at times that work for them, so that it's not just about saying a choice, it's about really providing choices. To the extent the state is providing support, that it should provide that support to the families with the greatest need, and to make sure that there is adequate supply of quality experiences, that there needs to be an outstanding workforce. And to have an outstanding workforce requires compensation, professional development, preparation, right? We're going to go into all of those conditions in much greater depth today, but that was certainly one of the priorities identified by the commission at its first meeting. So given those priorities, what are the tools the state needs, or what are the activities the state needs to be engaged in to make sure that it is providing those quality experiences and that family choice? One thing the group talked about is data, right? Like, we need to know what is actually happening out there so that we can plan accordingly and use data for constant improvement. We need a funding system that makes sense, right? That there are real needs in the community and that the state plays an important role in meeting those needs, but what's the most logical way for the state to do that? That's something that we're going to, again, get into in much more detail today. Support for families, right? That having options available is not the same as being able to take advantage of those options. And so what are the process supports for, young families who, may, if they're low income and have multiple young children at home, they don't have a lot of bandwidth. What are we doing to help them find the right setting for their children? What are we doing to make sure that the workforce is being adequately compensated to stay in their jobs, right? In a competitive economic market, as Virginia has right now, people are only going to stay in roles that allow them to meet their own needs, and that requires competitive compensation. And how are we going to make sure that the families using the system have adequate voice in its ongoing governance, so that it is constantly responding to their needs? So in conducting those activities and in building that vision, there are a lot of strengths that people identified of the existing system that the state can build on. One is the ready regions, right? That the state has already built up a regional infrastructure that allows it to provide service at a local level. Again, that state government has a role, but it's not an endless role. So how are you thinking about this at a community level? In the same vein, the fact that Virginia's system is a mixed delivery system that includes both public and private providers and a wide variety of private providers is also a strength, because it increases the odds that families are going to be able to find the setting that they're looking for. The cost of quality methodology in Virginia, again, is another strength. We're going to dive deeper into that today. That there's a commitment to this issue, right? That political leaders have shown that they're willing to support parent choice and make early childhood a priority, that there are public-private partnerships, right? That government is active, but it's not just government. And the existing data and the existing and emerging data infrastructure in Virginia does actually allow the state to use, information in ways that help make for a more sensible system. So as we think about what comes next, right, there are a number of questions that this group is going to want to wrestle with. One is, how are we using regional and local infrastructure? What is the right relationship between the state and that community infrastructure? How are we making sure that each is set up to succeed, right? We talked about the fact that the state plays a critical role, and there needs to be some amount of regulation and some amount of state financing, but that role is not limitless, right? That there needs to also be a limit on regulation, and that there are going to have to be other sources of funding because state government can only do so much. The group very much wanted to think about how do we leverage the multiple assets available to it, right? Which includes not just the assets we talked about in the early childhood world, but assets from outside early childhood world, both public and private, that can be brought to bear to help families get the experiences for children that they need. And happily, the group wants very much to plan for growth, right? That Virginia's economy is doing very well. The goal of the state, is to continue expanding the economy, and that means you're going to need more workers, and that means people are going to be moving here, and that those people who move here when they have young children are going to need places for their children to be. So again, that the state's got to think about this from a standpoint of how do we make this system not only better, but bigger, which is the right challenge to have. So that's the sort of basic overview. Does anyone have anything that they think I omitted, or is that all right? I'm not seeing anyone jumping up, so we'll keep going because I know we're on a tight timeline. So we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about the relationship of those quality experiences, that early childhood workforce, and what it all costs, right? And so I'm going to start with a few framing comments, and then I'm going to turn it over to Simon to really walk you through in much greater methodological detail what Virginia is doing and help you think about what it could be doing. But before we do that, there are a few slides. So, and I definitely don't have control of those, which is very much a good thing. So it's important to think about this. And one overarching thing I'd say as we get started is that when you think about supporting the workforce, there we go, right? There are a lot of elements that go into supporting the workforce, and you have to think of it a little bit like a boat, right? If the boat has 7 holes and you plug 5 of them, it might sink slower, but it's still sinking, right? So that this is not a question of like, do we do X or Y? It's really a question of like, how do we do all of these things to support the workforce that we need? Picking up on the admonition about sticky notes, as I'm talking, if you have anything you're thinking about with regard to either sort of important levers for improving the workforce or key expenditures, right, key cost drivers that you want to get on the table, please put those on a sticky note, and we will be collecting those just to get the conversation started. All right, so again, when we talk about quality, quality really matters in early childhood, and there's a few reasons that is. One is obviously it matters for the kid, right? The kid's been alive for what, 3 years, right? This is, every day is like a shockingly high percentage of their life, and that for the long term, both in the immediate term and for long-term development, for that child, being in a quality setting is really, really critical. And it sets the foundation for everything that comes later. It's also important for parents, right? And if you are a parent, and many of you I know are parents, you would not have gone to work if you didn't trust that your child was in a good place, right? That is fundamental. And we've seen data, right, that people leave the workforce if they can't find a setting for their child, particularly women, right? And so again, as Virginia thinks about its workforce of the future, making sure that this workforce support is in place is absolutely critical. It then also matters to all of us, right? That as we think about policy and what the state is trying to accomplish in education and the workforce, that those child experiences and those parent experiences are really key, right? That this has real-time implications beyond what's going on in that room where the child is. And so all of us have a stake in this work together. All right, on the next slide. Okay, so we've already opened the idea of quality and cost having this interrelationship, right? And the state does set some minimum regulation of what is required in a room where adults are being paid to take care of children, right? Staff-child ratios, things like that, which are important because you definitely do not want, I went to law school, right? We had one professor for 80 people, like with 3-year-olds, that would be terrifying. So the idea that young children benefit from having continuity is really important too, because in low-wage workforces, there is often a fair bit of turnover. And that comes at a cost to any business, and many businesses just sort of build that into their cost modeling. But that for a young child, continuity of relationships is key, right? Having the same caregiver day in, day out actually really matters to their development. So it's important to have a financing system that is meant to try to keep those adults with those kids for as long as possible. And you're never going to get to 0% turnover. You don't want that. But that from the kid's perspective, it's really important to sustain that continuity as much as you can. And for that, again, compensation is key, but it's not just compensation, right? It's about what is the workforce environment. And PS, like, again, all of you who are parents know, taking care of young children is exhausting. And so when you've got multiples of them, you're on all the time. And that makes it a difficult situation to start with. So how are you acknowledging that and building around it and providing supports in a way that is designed to make the workforce for early childhood professionals, it can be very rewarding, but can also be grueling. And how are you accounting for that in creating the context of this job? All right, on the next slide, this is, there's a few facts that are sort of immutable as far as this, that this group can't do much about, that really create the context in which we're having this conversation, right? One is that, well, some of this is less immutable. We'll get to more of that on the next slide. But that one piece of context that's really important, that is certainly traditional and probably isn't going to change, is that childcare is not funded the same way that pre-K or school are, right? Pre-K and school are public goods where the state, or the Commonwealth, as other states do, says, look, like, we are going to make spaces available for whoever shows up. And if kids show up, great. They're not, we're even going to require them to show up with some exceptions, but that in general, the expectation is that there will be a spot provided and that a kid will fill it. Neither of those things are true in early childhood. For childcare in particular, families are trying to purchase it in the market. And that can be very challenging, both to find a place that works for them and then to afford it, right? Because the state is providing a subsidy on the assumption that good care can be found, right? That subsidy, and again, we're going to get into this in much more detail, has to take into account the fact that parents of young children, by definition, have not reached their full earning potential, right? If you look at how the graph of how income increases over time, right? For the vast majority of people, they make steadily more as they go through their career. Parents of young children, by definition, are younger, right? So they have not had the time to build up assets. It's not like they got to save for college. So their means tend to be more limited. All right, so on the next slide, again, here are some fundamental things that really aren't changing. One is the cost of childcare is a very labor-intensive job, and that the costs of labor are going to drive that. This is not, something where technology can replace the person. You need people, and that creates a floor for the expenses that is not going away. The target market for childcare will always be adults who have not reached their full earning potential. You have a lot of younger families, right? People who are sort of at the very beginning of their earning trajectory. So it's never going to be otherwise. And that is part of the structure you're building into. It is also, as we said, absolutely essential for parents who want to be in the workforce to have somewhere to be able to put their kid. And for those families, participating in the workforce may be essential for them to then be able to provide for their children, right? So all of these things come together to create a very challenging situation. And what we're going to be doing today is talking about how we collectively can address that challenging situation. So with that introduction, I am now honored to turn it over to Simon Workman, and I hope you've written a lot on your sticky notes already, but if you haven't, you should definitely pick up the pace as Simon is going. And just to say a brief word about Simon, so, and what Simon's going to talk about. So, he's going to be, he's from Prenatal to 5 Fiscal Strategies, and is really going to go into more detail about how the mechanics of funding work in Virginia, and again, posing some of the key questions that this group is going to need to wrestle with to make that most sensible. So Simon, thanks so much.
Thank you, Elliot. Good morning, everyone. As Elliot said, I'm Simon Workman with Prenatal to 5 Fiscal Strategies. And a lot of what I'm going to cover, Elliot has started to lay the groundwork for, and we're going to go a little deeper in. I have some slides to share on some of the background of the early childhood financing system in particular, but then also talking about what you're already doing here in Virginia and the sort of progress you've already made that we can be building on. Am I saying next slide? I think that's the answer, right? So next slide. So just a little bit about us, Prenatal to 5 Fiscal Strategies. We're a national nonprofit that works across the country. We've done a lot of work here in Virginia over the years, but we do work across the country. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is informed by work across the country. What you are doing here in Virginia is really at the forefront of addressing a lot of the problems, but the problems exist nationally, right? They are not unique to Virginia that you have here. So I want to start off today by really talking about that problem and really sort of laying out where we are. So if we go to the next slide, and then the one after that, thank you. This is kind of a summary of what Elliot sort of laid out, right? This is why we are here today and why we are talking about this. There is a really strong evidence base, and you're going to hear a bit more about that later today, about why quality is so important. And, when you look at the brain architecture, when you look at the impact that high quality early learning environments have on children, especially children from low income families, and especially starting early. Historically, we have sort of said once you hit age 5, it becomes a public responsibility to educate children. But when you look at the brain science, you realize that actually starting from birth, there is the importance of interactions. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone's in a classroom type setting, at 9 months old, but it is about acknowledging the importance of the environments that children are in. And when you really get down to what is driving that quality, it is the workforce. And it is the people who are having those interactions with those children every day. And, when you look at sort of how early it starts, you realize why there's a lot of conversation about return on investment, about why investing early saves money later. When you are able to invest in high quality early learning programs, you see a decrease in the number of children needing special education services when they go into kindergarten, right? That is an example of a very direct that you save money in those K-12 years without even getting into where you save money in the long-term 20, 30-year funding cycle, the impact cycles. So what does this market look like right now where this quality exists? So on this next slide, this is sort of a fun graphic to sort of illustrate what this market looks like right now. So arguably, early childhood and childcare is a public good, but it is currently operated by a series of public and private entities. Largely it is run by private organizations, but there are all these different kinds of programs that exist, right? So you've got your sort of traditional family childcare home, where care is provided in a provider's home. You have the childcare center that might be non-profit or might be for-profit. You might have a faith-based program in a church or a synagogue, or a community program, or a private preschool, or a nanny, or an au pair. There are all these different places that families choose to take care of their children. And what this sort of diverse market looks like is very different for the different people in that market. So if you're a family, on the one hand, this looks like a lot of choice, right? You can choose from all of these different types of providers. But as Elliot already alluded to, the choice is somewhat of an illusion depending on, does this meet your needs for the hours that you're working? Can you afford this childcare? Do they have a spot available? Does it meet the cultural needs you want for your children? So what first looks like there's a lot of choice in this market, when you actually start talking about how it works in reality, that choice is really limited, with affordability being one of the biggest factors that impacts what families can actually choose. And from the provider point of view, there are all these different types of providers out there, but each one of these providers can access a different revenue source, right? Some they can access the same, but there's different revenue sources that, depending on where you sit in this graphic, depends on whether you can access that revenue source. And that revenue source has different standards, different reporting requirements, some of which overlap, some of which align, but many of which conflict, right? And so when you're a provider, you're faced with the choice of which revenue stream can I access for which children based on which location I'm in and what type of care I'm providing. But importantly, from a school readiness, from an educational outcomes perspective, from a quality perspective, we know that it is the programs that are the highest quality that have the biggest returns, the biggest impacts, and that quality can exist in any of these settings. Because when you talk about quality being about interactions, there is not a monopoly on quality in only a public school setting. There is not a monopoly on quality in only a Head Start center. Quality can exist in all of these settings with the right funding source, with the right support to actually support these programs. So let's look on the next slide at what this sort of funding system looks like right now and how the overall system is funded. So the graphic on the left is from a study that the National Academies of Sciences did a few years ago. So looking at what it costs to provide early childhood across the country and sort of how the system is set up. And it's sort of there's a 150-page report that goes behind this graphic, but the takeaway I want you to see is all of those lines at the bottom that are all overlapping. So all of the funding that's coming through the funnel, and you can see there, it's from families and federal government and philanthropy, et cetera. But the burden of how you manage all that funding lands on the providers and the families down there at the bottom of the graphic. So, the providers are the ones that have to deal with, well, can I take some money from families here and some money from this funding source here and some money from this funding source here? And they are forced to blend and braid it. Now, when the provider is spending their time dealing with all that funding source, what are they not doing? They're not spending time taking care of children. They're not spending time supporting the teachers in the classrooms with those interactions and doing the things that they're really good at, right? We are putting this burden on to say, the only way you can make it work in this system is if you sort of manage this hodgepodge of funding streams that come in. And on the right-hand side, what you see is kind of how the funding is currently divided up. Families are the largest payer in this country. This is national data of early childhood services. So, government funding is about, it's cut off there, I apologize, it's about 40% of the pie. Families are about 57%, and private sector kind of comes in at about 3% more. And what this means is it's very much still a privately funded system, and that has sort of challenges and opportunities, right? As you sit here thinking about public funding, right? Your slice of the pie is the smaller slice of the pie. But, when we also start talking about what families can afford, that's where you start to see why this system is broken, because those families over there who are covering 57, 60% of the expenses are really resource constrained. And that brings me to my next slide, which really sort of illustrates the broken market that we have right now and what we have been talking about for many years in this field. A lot of early childhood people have been talking about the broken childcare market. The US Treasury put out a report last year that actually talked about the broken childcare market. And that is about, if you look at those two big funding streams, right, private pay and subsidy, you have private pay on the one side, where families are really price sensitive. Everything we know is that families want quality, they value quality, but they cannot afford quality. So they're not able to demand it in the way they really want to, right? If they say, if you're a parent and go look for childcare for your child, you have a list of all the things you want. But ultimately, if you go find that thing and then find it's going to cost more than you can afford, you have to make constraints, right? Many of us would like a Lamborghini, but we can't afford it, right? So, there is a reality that says, yes, if you ask a parent what they want, they're going to tell you all these things. But the demand that they have in the market is they cannot afford the cost of quality when you talk about quality, including paying teachers adequate compensation. So what you have on the private pay side is this sort of market that encourages price competition. So providers, in order to keep their doors open, in order to be full, which you need to be full to have an effective business, they are always looking at how can they keep tuition low. And what happens there is that comes at the cost of paying the educators more and having actually real teacher compensation that encourages recruiting and retaining those high quality teachers. So then you go to the other side, right? And you go to public funding. So the childcare subsidy rates, childcare subsidy funded by the Childcare Development Fund, a state, federal program, is the primary public funding stream. And the way that rates have historically been set, the way that the determination of what is the cost, what is the value of the voucher that a family gets to go and pay for childcare in that private market, has historically been determined by a market rate survey, which looks at what is the market charging for childcare right now, and we are going to give you a voucher at some value of that rate. The problem with this is that it sort of exacerbates the problems in the private pay market. So if you're in the private pay market and there's price competition, that gets exacerbated over to the subsidy system. And you can see the rationale behind this, right? That government should only be paying what the market pays, right? Government shouldn't be sort of overpaying. But when you look and say the market isn't working and it's disproportionately having a negative impact on certain communities, low-income communities where they can't afford a lot for childcare, the providers don't charge very much. And so then the subsidy rate is low. And so then that program has limited investment from private pay and limited investment from subsidy, and kind of keeps it unable to improve in quality. So very few states, and one of the federal requirements around this is supposed to be that you set your subsidy rates at a certain percentage of the private market, which is supposed to be about the 75th percentile. Historically, most states have not managed to do that. Some set it as low as the 25th percentile. So, you've got a voucher and you can barely find a place that will take it. So in the last few years, states have had this ability, though, to, instead of setting subsidy rates based on the private market, to actually set it based on a cost model, based on a cost estimation model. Virginia is now one of only 3 places around the country. The others are New Mexico and the District of Columbia. So one of your neighbors and a very different place, that sets rates based on cost rather than price. So you have started to move to this approach that breaks down the connection between the private pay market and what public funding covers. And that starts to break down that disincentive that exists about investing in quality. So remember everything we said about the importance of quality, and then say, that is why you're starting to move to this approach that is actually recognizing the importance of not just looking at what families can afford to pay, but looking at what does it actually cost to provide services, and then let's reimburse them at that level, which is generally how the K-12 funding system works, right? Studies are done around adequacy studies or equity studies to say, what are the requirements you're asking K-12 schools to do? And then you figure out what it costs to do that. You don't look at what families can afford to pay for K-12 school and you say, what does it cost to do that, right? There's a whole separate thing about whether states fund at that level, but you at least know where you're starting. This is a similar approach about saying, let's look at what it actually costs. So before I go too much further, I do want to take a moment to look at some of the terms on the next slide about these sort of terms that get bandied around: price, cost, and then a new one you may not have heard so much about is true cost. So people often say, you know, childcare costs too much. The cost of childcare is too high. What they're really talking about is the price. This is the price that providers are charging, right? So this is reflecting what the market can bear, what families can actually pay. This is different from the cost because the price is really constrained by what families can pay. So how do providers make that work? Well, they are in a community site where they don't pay rent or utilities. They don't have substitutes or floaters in the classroom like they should have. Instead, the director goes and covers over lunch breaks or, you know, it's start and close of the day. They are making ends meet. They are working really hard every day. You talk to any provider, they're working really hard every day to make the dollars go absolutely as far as they can. But so what their posted tuition rates are is what I call the price, what we call the price, because it is the price they are charging. The cost is actually, if you look at what are the actual expenses that program incurs in order to operate, in order to meet those licensing standards or higher quality standards. And that represents all the costs a program incurs, including sort of accounting for any of those in-kind costs, accounting for actually being a fully staffed program, and importantly, allocating the costs by age to reflect the actual difference in cost of providing care for children of different ages. This is a really big difference here when you talk about price and cost. As Elliot talked about, families of young children are at sort of their least highest sort of earning power, right? When you have an infant, you have a lot of expenses, much more so than when you have a 4-year-old. But so at the time when you can least afford childcare is the time when childcare costs the most, because ratios and group sizes have to be a lot lower for younger children. So the way providers make this work is they don't charge as much for infant care as it actually costs them. And maybe they charge a bit more on preschool care and they kind of even it out, right? So across the program, they're looking at their budget on a program-wide basis. But it means generally the gap between what families can afford to pay and what it actually costs is much bigger for infants and toddlers, which is why you see a lot more infant and toddler childcare deserts. It's why it is much less profitable for providers to offer care for infants and toddlers than it is for preschoolers, because they cannot make up the true cost of care or the cost of care with private pay tuition or with the subsidy rates when they are based on that. The sort of third piece we add in here is the true cost. This is if you actually talk about the cost of a program that is operating at high quality, that includes paying teachers a robust salary, having robust staffing, having all of the resources that really are needed to support the full needs of children and families. We have a lot of research about what works in this system, and too often we are not able to actually look at funding it at the level of what is actually needed. We work in the scarcity mindset, right? So in that cost category, you can start to get closer to understanding, what it costs. But the true cost is when you say, what should we be paying teachers? What is the right staffing pattern for this program? What are the resources that are needed? And actually understanding the resources that should be going into these programs. And I apologize, some of the formatting is messed up on the screen. Hopefully in your packets it is okay. Otherwise, we can definitely make sure you have a full copy of this. So just briefly on the next slide, we've kind of covered this a little bit. I've kind of alluded to this already. I'm often asked in this field, why does childcare cost so much, but teachers make so little, right? It's kind of, where's all the money going? Well, the answer, you have to understand what is driving the cost of childcare. The majority of the costs, as sort of Elliot pointed out before, are on the personnel side. Around 70% of the cost of running a program is driven by personnel. And that's both what you're paying people and the salaries and the benefits, but also about the ratios and group sizes. So about, the number of children you have for each adult in the room and any additional staff you have in the room. And that's additional staff to allow teachers to do things like planning time, right? Doing planning time, not over a lunch break or not over a nap period where you're going to be interrupted if a child starts crying, right? Actually giving people the time to do that. If you actually look at that, that ends up being, additional personnel you need in the building. Of course, non-personnel costs matter as well and can really vary a lot between programs. Rent, lease, mortgage, utilities are, some of the bigger on that side, as well as supplies, equipment, transportation, food, sort of administrative costs. And yes, building in some money for an operating reserve. One of the important things we talk about is that if you just break even every year, then next year when your boiler breaks, you have no money, right? Like these are programs that are operating and have been operating for a long time on razor thin margins. They do not have big bank accounts sitting to cover for a rainy day fund. So when we talk to programs about identifying their true cost of operating, it's really important that we also talk about what do you need to make sure you're building a sustainable business. Because if you do not have a sustainable business, that is when programs go out of business. That is when we see, obviously COVID was a huge impact that no one was necessarily expecting, but there are smaller impacts like that that happen every day, smaller emergencies that happen to programs. And because of their razor thin margins, many of them end up closing after that. And that has a huge impact on access to childcare for families in that community, right? It's not just a loss of that business, it is a loss of those 100 children who used to have somewhere to go, now don't. And the 50 to 100 families that relied on that to go to work suddenly now are scrambling. And you start to see the impact that it has on the broader economy. So that's kind of the sort of dire picture of, the where we are and where the sort of system is in that broker market. I want to move now to remaining time and talk about some of the solutions about addressing this broker market, some of which you've already started to make great progress on here in Virginia. So we've moved to the next slide. And really recognizing sort of how you can build on that progress with the work you're all doing here at the Commission to make sure that you're building a sustainable system going forward. So I've kind of mentioned this idea of this cost-based approach, right? Moving from talking about a market-based approach to a cost-based approach. At the heart of that is this idea of building a cost model. And that is that understanding of what it actually costs to provide care, right? To get to that cost number, to get to that true cost number, what we talk about a lot is the need to build a cost model. And what is a cost model? So on the next slide, we'll talk about this concept of cost estimation modeling. At its heart, it is a process that is used to estimate what it is going to cost to provide care and resources and to remain a financially solvent provider, right? And so that kind of goes to that idea of having an operating reserve, that you need to be financially solvent. A cost model can examine not just what it costs sort of, on this day for this one particular program, but has differences based on the program size, the ages of the child served, the geographic region across a state, how fully enrolled the program is it collecting all of the revenue you're expecting, that bad debt number. You can also use it to demonstrate the impact of funding from those different sources, right? So if you think back to that earlier slide with all those different funding sources and potential funding sources, and I know you have something in your packet about the different funding sources that exist here in Virginia, when you look at that, you can say, okay, if the cost of this care is X, can the program sort of make it work with all of these different funding sources, right? And do they take the food program? Do they take subsidy? Do they take VPI? Do they take mixed delivery? How do you kind of put together to say, can you fill that full cost that exists? And if you can't, what is the gap, right? And identifying what is that gap and how does that gap differ by all those things in that second bullet, by the program size, by the age of the child, by the region, etc. And what can you do with the model? Well, you can use it to understand a lot, right? It gives a lot more transparency into this system that historically has been based on what families can afford to pay. And we talk about it being, the cost of childcare is what families can afford to pay. No, this gives you the insight into what it's actually costing, what it costs for the different requirements you have, so that if you have standards you're asking programs to meet, it's not an unfunded mandate, but it's actually talking about what is the cost to achieve that level of quality, to achieve that compensation level you're aiming for. And you can use a cost model for lots of different things, and you can use the outputs for a cost model for lots of different things. So if you look at the next slide, subsidy rate setting is a key one, and that is how you are using the cost model here in Virginia right now. You can also use it when you think about grants or contracts. So, one of the things that states are increasingly looking at is the subsidy rate setting, which is very much on a per child basis, but also looking at, if you were going to give a grant to a program to provide care for a certain number of children or to serve a certain need, reserving slots for infants, etc., you can figure out what it would cost us to run that classroom. And I know under the mixed delivery program, they are doing some work around using contracting there and looking at, what is a core number of slots you can fund, because then you're giving a lot more stability to providers, where it's less based on an individual child, but more about saying, what is the cost to operate that classroom? And we're going to make sure you have that sufficient and stable funding to do that. And the cost model can help make sure that you actually have enough money in that grant or that contract to do what you want to do. We've also seen states using it for costing out specific initiatives like a universal pre-K initiative or a, particularly targeting particular populations for quality improvement, understanding what it costs to reach a higher level of quality. But also then, importantly, that last bullet for systems change planning. The cost model I've talked about so far has been very much about the individual program basis, but you can also use cost modeling, the same concept of cost modeling, to look across the system and say, what are our goals for this system? How many children are we trying to reach? What is the mix of public funding and private funding that's going there? And what is that going to cost us? And what is that going to cost us incrementally over those years? This is to do this properly costs money, right? But we know that no one's going to wave a magic wand and you're suddenly going to have a ton of money tomorrow. So you have to talk about priorities. The modeling can help you understand where have the gaps been the biggest, and where then should you make your investments in a sort of incremental and data-informed approach. So I want to talk about CCDF rate setting a little bit, which is the main area that you have really invested in the state using cost model. So as many of you know, the Childcare Development Fund, CCDF, is the primary source of childcare assistance for low-income working parents. And states, as I said, can kind of set rates in these two ways, either the market rate study, which is what Virginia has done for many, many years, or this alternative methodology, which is using a cost estimation model, which is the move that Virginia made in 2022. We worked on the cost model in 2021. It came into 2022. So only for the last year or so, was a big change for Virginia. And on the next slide kind of illustrates sort of what this change in approach looks like. So the market rate approach, which is the sort of gray, the historic one that everyone used to do and Virginia used to do, used tuition prices. A survey was done of providers every year that said, what are your tuition prices? And then the state set rates at some level of that. There was not much transparency into what happened, right? You fill out a survey as a provider and then it sort of, disappears and then you get told your rate. That rate is very much, as I've said a number of times now, impacted by what providers are able to charge. And so if you're in a low-income neighborhood, your rate is lower. If you're in a family childcare home, family day home, where your rate does not reflect paying yourself a salary, then the subsidy rate doesn't reflect paying yourself a salary, right? So it sort of embeds all the bad things about the market. The cost-based approach can kind of go two ways. It can use current cost information, right? So that's really understanding, what does it cost right now for you to operate? But it can also integrate that true cost of care information. So understanding what it would actually take to have a more sustainable system, to have a system that can maintain and grow programs. And rate setting can be using both of these data points, right? So understanding, where are the current costs and where are the gaps with current costs, and where are the true costs and where are the gaps there. And for this, the data collection is a bit different, right? You can survey providers, you can do interviews and focus groups, but you're also going to be looking at secondary data, because if you just ask providers right now, what are your current costs? They're still in that scarcity mindset, right? They're still in how do they operate right now, which is different from, how they would really like to operate, which is why it's important to get their input. It can't be it's data informed, but it's not as data restricted as the market rate approach. The market rate approach is really, it's the data, you find a percentile, you set a rate, right? The cost-based approach, you have to talk to providers, you have to understand the way they actually operate to say, okay, so you provide family engagement activities. What does that look like? What is the cost there? What is the actual cost in staffing time that exists there? And there's also room here for making your priorities clear, right? There is, when you're looking at true cost, you make some decisions about what are your values as a state, as a community, about where you are going to invest. And one of those values often is about investing in teachers, right? And investing in the workforce, which is where you lead to putting in higher salaries than are currently paid into the cost model. So you're already accounting for those higher salaries. So this cost-based approach is fairly innovative. It is a new thing, across the 50 states and the territories. Only 3 places, Virginia, New Mexico, and DC, are actually implementing this. And this is not for the want of, that should not be seen as, you're an outlier. You're actually at the front of the pack. This is something that the US Administration for Children and Families has been encouraging for a long time, since at least 2016, when they made it available. The problem is, historically, there has not been the money to do it, right? The federal government didn't put more money in. So as we've seen increases in CCDF funding in the last few years, we've seen people paying more attention to this. There are some states who are not doing the full alternative methodology, the full cost-based approach, but they're adjusting their market rates to account for the sort of higher cost that exists for infants and toddlers. And importantly, you're at the front of the pack, but there are a number of states nipping at your heels. We're working with several states right now who are moving to this approach for their next state plan for next year. And I'll also point out that there have been lots of talk up in DC about new federal funding for early childhood, right? From on the left, Build Back Better, but also on the right, there's been lots of talk about reauthorizing the Child Care Development Fund and CCDBG. And on both sides of the aisle, the conversations about more money have been tied to this idea of moving to this cost-based approach. So, as we talk about the hope for ultimately more federal funding for early childhood, it is highly likely that any of that federal funding is going to require states to actually take this cost-based approach rather than the market rate approach, because there is a full recognition of just how broken the market is, and you want to be putting money into the system that's actually going to have the biggest impact, which is taking account of the cost. And so this impact can be huge. And so on the next slide, I just listed out some of the sort of overall ways we've seen this impact of cost-based rate setting. And I know the folks from VDOE and VECF can talk more specifically about the impacts here in Virginia specifically. But I know all of this is true for Virginia and has been true for all of the places that have implemented this rate setting. That we see the biggest impact is for programs serving populations where the gap between what families can afford to pay and the true cost is greatest, right? So that sort of makes sense, but that is for infants and toddlers and for programs in low-income communities, because that is the place where the market is the most broken. So it's where the cost-based approach can have the biggest impact. So when you run the cost model and you say, who is furthest away from the true cost when you look at the current rates or the sort of rates based on the market, it is for infants and toddlers, which is why you see a lot of childcare deserts in infants and toddlers. It is for low-income communities, which is why you see a lot of childcare deserts in low-income communities. And often also in rural areas, depending on the sort of nature of that rural area where there doesn't exist a market, right? So clearly, so there isn't that sort of that ability to sort of have the true pay. And also, depending on the decisions you make in the cost model about, actually recognizing the cost of operating in a rural area, right? In some ways, people talk about, oh, it's cheaper in a rural area, but also, to recruit people to work in that rural area can sometimes cost more, and the needs in that rural area can be different. And so the cost model can really take that into account. We also see a huge impact for family day homes. So, historically, home-based providers take whatever is left over at the end of the month. And unsurprisingly, there's not much left over at the end of the month, right? Home-based providers are often get into the business by looking after their own children and taking a few more. And then they sort of carry on doing that, serving, 6, 8, 10 children in their home. And, maybe that's fine where your mortgage is paid off, you have a spouse or a partner who's covering health insurance, etc. But that is an aging population. That is an aging population that is serving some key demographics, often in rural areas. Often it's the only childcare that exists in a rural area through family day homes, often serving overnight care, non-traditional hours. If all of those people retire, if it's only able to operate if you have this sort of, model where you've paid off your mortgage, then there is going to be a huge access issue for certain populations. In the cost model, we build in an income for the home-based provider. That's not saying they're changing their tax status and suddenly becoming an employee, but you build into the model an actual income, and they can take it however they want. But it means that then when you're setting rates, you're actually being comparable to centers where people are paid an income, right? Rather than, this idea that home-based care is cheaper, it's only cheaper on the backs of the women who are providing that care, right? And if we're honest about what it actually costs to provide care and pay people what they're worth, it is actually going to cost more money than families can afford. This can also impact encouraging more providers to accept public subsidies. One of the big issues in the system right now is that if you can get $1,000 from a private pay family or $750 from the subsidy, what are you going to take, right? Now, if that subsidy is paying $1,000 as well, you are more likely to be a provider who accepts subsidies. So for those families, we go back to that slide with all of the different types of providers on, what looks like choice. For those families, if no one takes your voucher, that's not a choice, right? It's a voucher to nowhere, as one of our colleagues says. So actually, if you are paying subsidies at a higher level, you are more likely to be expanding the number of providers who take subsidies, expanding choice for families who are relying on those subsidies to pay for care. And then finally, that impact can really be responsive over time. So as things change, as new requirements come in, as costs change, as inflation increases, as minimum wage increases, you can use the cost model to actually be making sure that there is not a negative impact on providers of those changes, that you're actually acknowledging what it's going to cost to be at those different levels, to meet those new requirements, and actually reimbursing them for that amount. So to wrap up, I want to share on this next slide, and I'm not sure how it's going to come up. So maybe let's click one more time. There, that's good. And we'll just pause there. So there are sort of 3 pillars of what I call a responsive early childhood education system or a childcare system. And we heard Elliot talk about them before, and I think you've all talked about them at your last meeting. This idea of you need quality, you need access, and you need affordability. Those are sort of the principles of this system that I think, it sounds like you're all very much agreed on that you want to have here in Virginia. Well, for those principles, if we click one more time, please, each of those principles kind of has some goals associated with them, right? And so, if you look at on quality, the idea would be that the goal there would be that programs have access to funding that enables them to pay competitive compensation at a level that can recruit and retain a skilled workforce. And I think a speaker later is going to talk about the importance of that workforce to quality even more. But so under this responsive system, it's clear that you need to have the funding in order to pay for that workforce, right? Then next, under access, you want to make sure that families actually have a real choice. So that means actually access to care that meets their needs, so that is available at the times they want it to be, that is providing the type of care they need, whether that be 9 till 5, Monday to Friday, whether that be 3 hours a day for some socialization, whatever that looks like, making sure that families actually have that real choice. And on the program side, that means that programs have to have access to a stable and sufficient funding stream that allows them to provide that childcare supply, right? That is responsive to that family demand. If you want to have non-traditional hours care available, if you want to have overnight care available, programs need to have stable funding that allows them to make that space available to families. If you want to make sure that families have access to infant and toddler care, even though the market is not responsive to that. Programs need to have the funding to provide that infant and toddler care. So that stable funding is what programs need in order to make plans for the future, in order to invest in opening up that next classroom that provides that access for families. They need to know that that funding is not a one-time funding, but it's a continuous funding that's going to be there and enables them to invest in their business. And finally, on affordability, families need to be able to afford childcare, and the definition of what is affordable changes when you change the definition of what childcare costs, right? If you talk about childcare costing $1,000 a month, the question of who can afford that and who needs support to afford that is very different from when you look at the true cost of childcare and say, now it's $2,000 a month, right? Suddenly that idea of low-income working families that need support actually moves much more into middle income, right? Because it moves much more into the place where, a firefighter and a teacher actually can't afford $50,000 a year for 2 kids to go to childcare, right? So then the question of, who is eligible for public support starts to change, as well as what you should expect from those families to be contributing. And so the next, if you click one more time, the next thing is the list of strategies and what you can do to achieve these principles and these goals. And you'll see as I go through these, a lot of these you're already doing. A lot of these you have started to make progress on. And, I'm here to encourage you to keep making progress on. On that quality side, moving to the cost-based rate setting means that you are able to actually have a methodology that sets subsidy rates based on that pay. You also need to increase the number of children who are covered by public funding at that rate, right? A program, it's great if a program can get the full cost of quality from their subsidy kids. But if subsidy kids are 10%, if the other 90% can't afford to pay at that level, you're not making the big change in the system, right? You can't actually afford the salaries that are built into the subsidy rate if families can't afford that as well. So that's where you have to integrate the idea of who actually needs support to get there. How are we making programs whole to cover the full cost of quality across the different funding streams? Which kind of goes to the access piece, right? Making sure that that cost-based approach is a stable revenue stream, that it is across all parts of the system. So you haven't just got, well, for these children, we have, full funding, but for these children, because they're on a different funding stream, it's based on the market still, and it's not responsive, right? You have to take this approach across the whole system to avoid that siloing of the system. You also have to make sure that the payment practices you have in place are really focused on the reality of how programs budget. If you tell a provider that you get this rate, but only when a child turns up, if that child doesn't turn up, you're still paying the teacher, but you're not getting paid, right? That's not how the private pay system works, right? It's not how the public system should work either. And then finally, on affordability, as I kind of alluded to already, the idea that you need to increase the eligibility to include those middle income families, to understand who cannot afford care and then who needs support to afford care, which isn't necessarily a universal free for everybody model, but it is about saying, what do you expect families to pay? The sort of definition that the federal government puts out there and a lot of states and communities have kind of taken on board is the idea that families shouldn't pay more than 7% of their income on childcare. Many now are paying 20, 30% of their income. So when you start looking at who needs help to access care, you can also talk about what should we be expecting of families to pay? If we expect them to pay no more than 7% of income, let's build a system that is responsive to that. Your co-payment system right now is actually very good and doesn't ask a lot from families. And as you look at eligibility expansion, you can start to talk about saying, let's have people pay a share, right? But let's be honest about what that is affordable, right? It's not 20, 30%. It is more in that 7 to 10% range. So when you kind of look across this system, this is the sort of where I sort of see the vision of the funding system of how do you make sure you've got quality access and affordability, and how do you make sure that you have strategies in place to get to those goals. And as I said, I'm really heartened by the work that Virginia's done over the last few years and the work that this commission is doing to sort of make progress on this. Hopefully you see yourself in a lot of those places where you've already done a lot of these things. But for this system to keep going, you need to make sure that it is sustainable and that this carries on, right? That the programs have that certainty that the funding levels are still going to be there, that the approaches to funding are going to be there, so they can respond in the market. So they can open the classrooms, they can respond to the demand that exists there, knowing there's going to be funding in place to support it. And that is all from me. Thank you.
Simon, before we let you go, if folks have questions, would love to give them a chance to ask those. And to foreshadow a little, we're going to be moving into a small group discussion at your tables where we're going to ask you to think about the most critical levers for continuing to improve Virginia's childcare system, and what are some of the key cost drivers, right, that you think it may be worthwhile for Virginia to address. And in that spirit, Simon, maybe if you forgive me for jumping in with a question, but that on the previous slide, you talked about some of the key elements of the Virginia system and noted that Virginia has done a lot of things very well, which is a great place to start. Are there any specific things you've seen, and there may not be, but are there any specific things you've seen other states do that, knowing the Virginia context, you would say, oh, you know what, like that was a good idea, and that you would suggest for Virginia to potentially adopt?
Yeah, and I think partly a flip to that is things that states have done that they shouldn't have done, and that Virginia did do, right? I mean, I think, when you look across the places that have done the methodology of moving to cost modeling, I think, a key decision point is what is the salaries you're going to build into that model, right? Because salaries are a key driver. And a place like New Mexico that we do a lot of work with, so, we help build their model, so I'm not speaking out of turn about them, but they made a decision that said, we're going to put in sort of somewhat lower salaries, kind of salaries more at the current, but then we're going to try and move everybody to the full cost of quality. In Virginia, what you did was you were more honest about what the salary should be to get there, right? And so the cost model we have here in Virginia actually puts in salaries at the level that we ultimately should be getting to. So you're honest about what it costs to afford high quality. Now, the reality of budgets are you can only afford to spend the money that you have, right? And so, at some point you have to make a decision about what percentage of the cost of quality you're going to pay at. And I think, and Virginia's paying at about 75% of the cost of quality, right? Which is, still a huge increase on where you were. But it means that there is honesty in the model about what it actually costs. And I think, to me, one of the great things about these models is the transparency it gives you. In the New Mexico model, now where they're moving to say we want to increase salaries, you're going back to people and saying, well, what we said was the cost of quality is not quite the cost of quality. It's got this nuance to it, right? So I think that's one thing that you definitely did really well. I think the other thing that's really important is to acknowledge that when you put the cost of quality numbers out there, the question of who can afford that is really important. And so that question about eligibility and who now has access to care, who has access to the subsidy is really important. And, Virginia did make movements on the eligibility and increased it significantly. This is where New Mexico went really far and went to 400% of the federal poverty level, right? So almost 90% of, families are covered in some way by the subsidy system there, right? It does come down to, your decision points. Ultimately, it's all about moving pieces, because if you serve more children, can you pay them at a higher level, right? And it does become of what is your pot of money? But I think it's really key to look at, if you are now saying, we as a Commonwealth are saying this is the cost of care, how are you making sure providers can get that cost of care for everybody in their program? And if families cannot afford that, then public funding needs to be coming in and filling that, right? And so I think that mix becomes really important.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have kind of a two-part question here, and really just thinking about our economy nationally. We are a consumer spending economy, so GDP is driven by consumer spending. Have there been any studies that have shown at what point, as a percentage of income, that one of two things happens? You either have a reduction in spending elsewhere, which then has a different impact on the overall economy, or you have people leaving the workforce, right? So at some point you have to make on a personal level, that decision, does this make sense for me? Have there been studies that really that showcase that tipping point, or do we understand that tipping point?
I don't know if there's been studies that have shown the sort of tipping point, which is kind of what I'm sort of hearing a little bit. There have been studies that have been done that show, what that try and sort of quantify what the impact is of, so for some families, right, they look and say, well, if I'm making $30,000 a year and childcare is going to cost me $30,000 a year, that's a slam dunk, I shouldn't work, right? There have been studies that have tried to quantify better what that $30,000 actually looks like, right, in terms of lost earning potential over time and lost retirement contributions, et cetera, to kind of be clear on, why it is sort of not as simple of a one-for-one. I don't know if there's been studies that have shown like where that tipping point actually is on that. I mean, I think in general, that is a sort of well understood idea that, and there have been studies that have shown the impact of, for every, I'm gonna make sure I get this right. There's studies that have shown like for every sort of % decrease in the cost of care, there's an increase in maternal workforce participation, right? So they've sort of shown like, especially like in Washington, D.C., where they had universal pre-K for a long time, studies there showed there was a sort of 12 percentage point increase in maternal workforce participation because that was actually associated with the fact that you now weren't paying $20,000 a year for childcare. So it doesn't fully answer your question, but it's sort of, I think it's kind of understood, but not necessarily well studied unless anyone else in the room has sort of knowledge of those studies.
Thank you. Other questions before we break into small groups? And Simon, I assume that if small groups have specific follow-up questions.
Yes, I'm around.
Yes. Any other questions that folks want to ask while we're still together? All right, so you have 40 minutes in your small group. And again, based on what you've heard so far, would like each group to be discussing what you see as sort of key levers that the state should be addressing going forward, key cost drivers that you'd like the state to do something about. And again, there are a number of folks who can come help you if you have any follow-up questions. But now I will turn it over to all of you to dig into it. And I guess the folks on Zoom will talk to each other. Great. End of noon. So if we're not doing a report out at this time, so if the groups want to keep chatting, you're welcome to. But on the agenda, this is our 15-minute break for members of the commission and staff to grab lunch. So would encourage you to do that. We are going to reconvene at 12:05. And at that point, we'll be hearing from Daphne. So again, if you need to wrap up some loose ends, please do. We'll come and collect the stickies, and then we'll look forward to coming back at 12:05. Thanks again. All right. We have a lot to cover. And so in order to keep us on schedule, I'm going to sadly interrupt your lunch. But the good news is that I'm here to introduce Daphne Basak from the University of Virginia, who will be talking to us more about the assets and challenges of Virginia's early care and education workforce. Just to jump ahead so that you know what's coming, after Daphne's presentation, I'm going to summarize some of the themes that we heard this morning and that you already talked about in your small groups. And then we're going to have small group conversations really focused on drilling down into like, what are the absolute key things that need to be in the commission's report? As you heard at the beginning, that report is due October 1st. You have one more meeting before that report is due. So whatever direction you're going to give us, we've already gotten a strong sense from the first meeting and from the work that's already been done here today, but that whatever final instructions you're going to have, like that is when you're going to produce them. So you will do so armed with the benefit of Daphne's wisdom, but just wanted to jump ahead to that so that you're ready. That having been said, while Daphne's presenting, if you have any additional thoughts that you want to share, please do put those on stickies and we will collect those and integrate those into the report out. So without further ado, Daphne.
Okay. Well, I hope you guys can enjoy your lunch. And my goal is to tell you a little bit about work we've done in partnership with the Virginia Department of Ed and the Virginia Early Childhood Foundation, primarily around workforce as kind of a key lever of improving quality and access. So next slide. Okay, so we and my team at the University of Virginia, we're called the Study of Early Education through Partnerships, and our key partners are here in this room now. We've been working really closely since around 2019 with the Department of Education and VCF, basically on trying to get the data needed to really understand the problems you all are working on. And so it's really hard to solve the problems if we can't describe them, if we don't understand what things look like in Virginia. So really expanding kind of the kind of data we have access to and the kinds of questions we can answer. And so towards that, we have been doing a few things. Since 2019, we've been running statewide surveys of all early educators working in publicly funded early childhood programs in the states, and that's family childcare homes, childcare, Head Start, pre-K, that's the teachers, but also the directors, the leaders, the principals working on early childhood. We've also been doing lots of surveys. We have one out in the field now of the families in Virginia who have young children 0 to 5 to understand what their needs are, what they're looking for, what's working well, but also what gaps are in the system. Then we use that data and also do a lot of kind of evaluation work. So as Virginia rolls out a variety of really innovative policies, including some of what Simon talked about around the new reimbursement rates for subsidies or other policies, we are often the ones evaluating those to try to test, did these work the way we wanted? Did they have the effect we wanted? And my own kind of focus sort of throughout my career working in early childhood has been on early educators and policies aimed to support early educators. That's kind of a key lever. And so that is what I will be talking about today. Next slide. So I think this has come through in all the presentations today, but one of the kind of key points we wanted you to take out of the meeting today is what a central role the workforce plays, both when we talk about quality in early childhood and when we talk about access in early childhood. So our big goals right now is how do we build a high quality program that's available to all the families who need that for their children and to participate in the workforce. And to make that happen, kind of the key driver of that is teachers. So thinking about the quality side, there's kind of a huge literature around the roles that adults play in the lives of kids and the roles that interactions play for young children's development. And so engaging responsive interactions with an educator can make huge differences. And you all probably have seen a lot of the research showing what a high quality early childhood opportunity can do for children as far as their development in those years, but also as far as really long-lasting impacts when they get into school, as they continue throughout their schoolings, graduate, go into the workforce. So early childhood programs can make a big difference. And when people say high-quality early childhood, they're not really talking about the space or the equipment. You can do a lot in all sorts of different spaces with all sorts of different materials. What they're talking about is there a caring adult engaging with the children who's able to respond to children's needs and help them learn. And so a huge part of how we build a high quality program is having the workforce that can be responsive. So that's the link to quality. What's become really clear probably to all of you is also the strong link between the workforce and access. When there are no teachers available, we can't have early childhood opportunities, and that's become really salient in the past few years, where most childcare centers in Virginia have had to turn families away, shut down classrooms, or shut down temporarily or long-term because they were not able to find teachers to be in the classrooms that could meet those needs. So finding ways to make sure we are getting teachers in the classroom, getting the right teachers in the classroom, compensating them so they want to stay in those classrooms and continue to do that job is kind of the key driver through which we have an opportunity to improve early educators. From a research side, the kind of importance of adults in the lives of young kids and early educators for quality is really strong. And yet sort of societally and how we have funded this a long term, as I sort of show on the next slide, has not traditionally been very good, especially in childcare centers. I'll sort of echo what Simon talked about around the different kinds of way we do early childhood in this country. But in childcare centers, And this is a headline from sort of a few years back. It says, why are our most important teachers paid the least? And so there's this sense at which if you look at when kids are able to learn the very most and where kids are showing the hugest growth in their capacity to learn, and we know adults can have the most impact and could really shape their development in that moment, that ends up being a place where we treat teachers really, really differently than how we do even once a child is 5 or 6 or 7, even though sort of from a learning perspective, it's actually in those early years where kids can be impacted most from the environment around them. So there's a lot of questions about why do we have an early childhood workforce that is compensated so differently from the way we compensate teachers at other sort of stages in life, and one in which we in turn see a workforce characterized by high rates of poverty, which then links to everything else I talked about, a stressed out workforce is hard, it struggles more to have those kinds of engaging interactions. They are less likely to stay at their jobs, more likely to quit, creating disruptions for kids and also disruptions for families. When teachers leave, young kids lose out on those kind of connected relationships, but also oftentimes families are not able to go to work that day or go to work that week as centers sort of struggle to fill in. So there is this kind of big picture question of why this workforce looks the way they do. Next slide. All right, so in the presentation today, I wanted to use some of the data we've collected and the evaluation work we've done so far to first just give you a really concrete sense of what this workforce looks like and what childcare teachers in Virginia look like, how they're being compensated, how much they're turning over. So you kind of see the seriousness of the current landscape. And then I want to highlight ways in which Virginia has really, really been a leader on the workforce side, and particularly the workforce compensation side, and work we've done sort of like going around the country and seeing other communities and states trying to follow Virginia's lead on some of the strategies used so far. And the main takeaway that I hope comes through is this need to focus specifically on this workforce as you all try to think about ways to improve access and quality in Virginia. Okay, next slide. So I think as Simon highlighted, there are a lot of different programs through which families can get early childhood opportunities. And I put up here the 4 main publicly funded ways that families in Virginia are getting early childhood opportunities. So on the childcare side, we have family childcare homes, which are home-based settings where a provider is taking care of a relatively small group of children in their house. There's childcare centers, which is kind of the largest of these sectors, providing care to the most children 0 to 5 in Virginia. And these are small businesses, privately funded, which are getting public dollars through the subsidies, which ties into what Simon was talking about. What are the subsidy rates? How much do they help them actually cover the cost of the services they provide? And then we have Head Start, which is federally funded and targeted primarily to the lowest income children. And here in Virginia, we have VPI and a school-based pre-kindergarten program. And now all of these places are basically trying to do the same things as far as supporting young children's development and also serving a really critical role for families as far as allowing people to go to work, go to school, do things that they need. But they look quite different on many dimensions. Part of that is because they've had totally different historic goals. Our public funding for Head Start, as you know, is part of the war on poverty and really focused on addressing the needs of very poor families. Childcare subsidy system came about as a work support, whereas for mothers and families, whereas school-based pre-K was very focused on children and children's learning and development in their origin. But today, all those programs are serving both of those needs of like supporting the workforce, supporting parents and families' needs, and supporting young children's development. But they do completely, their scopes are really different. The hours of care they can provide families, when those hours are, do they have evening care? Do they have weekend care? Are they only for 4-year-olds, or can they take your infant and toddlers? Those really vary systematically across the systems. And they also have completely different funding levels. The amount of money they're working with per child is completely different. And they have very different regulations, what they require as far as things like ratios or who can be a teacher at each of these programs is really, really different. So we have this fragmented system where we have a lot of early educators, but what we require of them, how we compensate them, how we support them, what their job looks like, how many months a year they work can look incredibly different across these 4 sectors. All of the programs, when done well, can be great, and they offer families really different kinds of supports that families might value more or less and kind of sort into based on their needs. But the supports the programs themselves have and their resources they're starting with vary quite a bit. So let me try to talk through that a little bit more concretely on the next slide. One of the main things that really differs from my perspective as someone who's really concerned about the workforce is just how differently the pay looks for teachers working across these sectors. So the far right bar is the average hourly salary of a pre-K teachers working in the public schools. And so you can see that on average, public school pre-kindergarten teachers are making just under $30 an hour. And if you go backwards to the left, the next bar is Head Start at around $20 an hour. And for childcare centers, it's about $16 an hour on average, though it varies quite a bit around the state, with essentially childcare teachers making roughly half of what teachers in pre-K programs are being paid, despite doing quite similar work. And those differences in compensation reflect differences in funding levels and all the issues that Simon was raising around centers being reliant on what families are willing to pay or able to pay to send them to these private programs, and what is left relative to public schools who have the guarantee of being able to pay teachers at a much higher rate. Next slide. You can also see there are really big differences in kind of any benefit that we look at as far as what supports are offered to teachers. So this is for lead teachers working in sites. Nearly all pre-kindergarten teachers told us that they can access health insurance through their site and a variety of other supports. You can see that that's less than half as high for childcare teachers as far as being able to access sort of basic needs support within their program. So the jobs just look quite different. Next slide. And what that ends up meaning is that the workforces across these settings are quite different. One of the really cool things we've been able to do through our data collection with VDOE and VECF this year is start to be able to get statewide data on how much teacher turnover is actually happening. And the result, I say it's cool because it's important to have the data, but it's not cool from the perspective of just what the results are showing us. So overall, if we look at all early educators across all Virginia early education programs, we see that 37% of teachers who are there in one fall are not there the next fall. That is a staggering rate of turnover. If you thought of 2 in 5 K-12 teachers leaving from one year to the next, that would be incredibly disruptive to schools operating. And yet that's standard across early childhood, that we're constantly getting new teachers, having to retrain them. The investments we're making in kind of quality curriculum supports all walk out the door if those teachers are leaving. And you can see that across the board, it is much higher in childcare centers, which are those first 2 bars. Those are lead and assistant teachers working in Virginia childcare sites compared to the public school system. Even public school pre-K teachers turn over at higher rates than the rest of K-12 teachers, but it is still quite a bit lower than what we see in childcare, which is not surprising given what I've shown you about their compensation levels. Next slide. Okay, a lot of those patterns have been longstanding. They've been true in Virginia. They've been true all over the country. And so this is a workforce, and particularly the child care half of that picture I showed you is one that has been struggling historically. And then COVID hit, and COVID made a lot of these challenges far more pronounced. It impacted the childcare sector in a number of ways. One was that childcare stayed open when a lot of other organizations, and particularly schools, shut down. They operated at a high risk and also had to sort of reduce enrollment to stay within guidelines. Lots of sites lost money. Another major problem was that families started to disappear, so enrollments dropped, and the workforce started to vanish as well. So in the first months of the pandemic, a large share of early educators left the workforce. And one of the things that's been really striking is that as we've seen a bunch of other industries and sectors sort of bounce back from that period of time, we've seen childcare go very slowly in that recovery from the perspective of rebuilding the size of the workforce. Part of why that's true is because many other low-wage industries increased their wages considerably during the pandemic and since, as far as in places like food service, Target, Walmart, those kind of jobs, wages really increased during this time period. And childcare centers, for all the reasons that Simon sort of discussed, could not be responsive in the same way. So they are still offering those kind of lower wages. And teachers are saying, I could potentially work a lot less hard than I'm working at this job while making more money. So many teachers left, and that has had sort of serious impact both on quality and on access for Virginia families, as I'll sort of show you in the next few slides. Okay, so one thing on the left that we showed is we've been able to track how much early educators in a sample of Virginia teachers were making across 2019, 2020, 21, 22. And what you can see is that these are sort of put in fixed wages to account for inflation. So once you account for inflation, there was a bit of a bump in 2022, but since then we have either been sort of stable or almost going downhill on wages for the Virginia educators. And relatedly, on the right, we were showing things like depressive symptoms among this workforce. And so this is a workforce that is being asked to do a whole lot of hard work. They're not getting paid very much in this sample of teachers. And you can see a real increase in mental health problems among these teachers right around 2020 that has just stayed there. So that raises concerns, of course, around what it means to have teachers that are struggling so much themselves when they are trying to take care of a group of toddlers. And that has raised concerns about how to support them. Next slide. The problems that I've talked about are true across all childcare centers, and we collect data from all childcare centers in Virginia, but we oftentimes look at the centers that do and don't serve Virginia's poorest children through childcare subsidies. And everything we've talked about is more pronounced and more challenging for those sites that are participating in the subsidy and serving kids with the highest need. And so if you look kind of on the left, that first bar, it's showing you the percentage of Virginia childcare centers, the directors, that said staffing was challenging for them. And in that sample, basically 94%, nearly all teachers all childcare directors are saying that it is hard to staff. 58% of them, 60% of them roughly, say it's very hard for them to hire teachers. And those problems are even are still very high in private centers that don't accept dollars, just a little bit lower. So 85% of those sites were saying they are struggling to hire teachers. And you can see there are also considerable differences in what sites pay, which might explain some of this. In the sites that do participate in the subsidy system, pay ends up being about $2 lower than the sites that don't. And again, I know we have sort of said this a lot, but this relates to the cost modeling issues that Simon was talking about before. So the subsidized sites are relying on those subsidies to get money for the main thing they're spending their dollars on, which is paying their teachers. When they don't have those resources, they can't pay competitive wages and are losing teachers at high rates. Next slide. And what these staffing challenges do is that they really impact what's happening in those centers and how they're able to operate. So those first set of bars there say, we asked the director, how much would you say current staff are working more hours or taking on additional duties because you're not able to staff? So you can see in the subsidized sites, 80% of them saying, I have to make my teachers do more because I just don't have the staff. And that's still quite true for the majority of Virginia centers, even the ones that are not relying on subsidies. You can see 64% of sites say I have to hire inexperienced or underqualified staff. We have lots of them telling us, I'll just get anybody who walks through the door just to be able to keep the center open. So struggling to hire teachers. The one that I think is the most striking and that we point out the most is in that third bar around serving fewer children and or turning families away. This is 63%, so about 2/3 of childcare centers in Virginia saying, I am not serving families because I can't find teachers to keep the classrooms open, and so we have to turn families away. So that's happening at high rates, as is reducing the number of kids you're willing to serve at all or shutting down the sites. So you can see that when sites are not able to get the resources they need to get the compensation up to the levels they need, not only does that make it a not very appealing job for those teachers, it has impacts on their stress, their well-being, the quality of interactions that they can produce. It has impacts on who wants to go into this field, who's willing to do this hard and important work. And it has impacts for families who are relying on this and can't go to work because those sites are closed or temporarily shutting down some of their services. Next slide. Something that we have looked at a lot is like, does money solve this problem? And to what extent could providing more dollars into this workforce lead to better outcomes? And so early on in our partnership, we started to just look at, okay, we have lots of sites. They all have high rates of turnover, but does turnover relate to how much you're paying teachers within Virginia's childcare sites? And so those first 4 bars, we basically said, let's look within each Virginia community and say, are the sites that are paying teachers more seeing less turnover than the sites that are paying teachers less? And you can see that first bar is saying in the communities that pay the least, the quarter of communities paying the least, the sites that pay the least have about 30% of their teachers leaving over an 8-month period. That's an incredibly high rate of loss of churn of teachers. So about 1/3 leaving over 8 months. And you can see that in contrast, in the quarter of sites paying the highest wages to teachers, it's about half that high. So in sites that are able to compensate teachers better, we see considerably less turnover. That's true for the lead teachers. That's true for the assistant teachers. Okay, so from that first kind of descriptive data we got from our survey, there was kind of a few key takeaways. I think an obvious one is the current compensation levels in childcare are leading to really serious staffing problems with implications for the kids and the families. And what I want to talk about for the rest of the presentation is ways that Virginia has tried to tackle this really effectively and address these problems using kind of compensation-first strategies where we try to move the wages up to in a way that will address these issues. All right, next slide. One of the main kind of initiatives that Virginia has tried that I think has gotten a lot of attention nationwide is Recognize B5. Some of you may have already heard about this program, but the idea of Recognize B5 was to basically provide teachers with financial incentives, with the goal basically being, let's try to offer teachers better compensation in exchange for staying in their site. And the idea was, with more compensation, perhaps teachers feel less stressed out, they feel more engaged in their job. We see better interactions for kids, hopefully less turnover, less of that sense of throwing away investments when teachers walk out the door. So in 2019, we basically worked with VDOE and VECF to pilot this idea of saying, let's offer teachers, at the time we were offering them $1,500 if they remained in their site over an 8-month period. So not a huge amount of money, but the idea was, given that at the time many childcare teachers were making on average around $22,000 a year, $1,500 seemed like a considerable investment, and we were trying to test out, would giving them a little bit more money make a difference in the likelihood they stayed? So in that first year, we made this available to any publicly funded early education program participating in the preschool development grant program that we were working on. And in that year, what we did is we basically ran an experiment. And we said, let's take these resources And because we didn't have them available for absolutely everyone and didn't have the funds to offer this to everyone, we said, let's just test it to see if it works. And what I mean by that is that in one Virginia community, we said, okay, we can't afford to do everyone, so let's get as many sites enrolled in the program and then let them know that we're going to basically be doing a lottery where some sites are going to be able to get access to these resources and some sites won't. And then we'll follow to see what happens to these sites over the 8-month period that we had to see if turnover changes across the sites. So our overall question was, is this going to reduce turnover? And what this, and I should say, when we first did this, we did this in schools, we did it in family childcare homes, and we did it in childcare centers. So any kind of publicly funded program. And our main result was that in the sites where we did not offer this program, in the 8 months that we looked at, roughly 75% of teachers were still there when we looked 8 months out, meaning a quarter of teachers had left. This is in schools and in childcare centers. Now, in those sites where we offered the incentive, like where you could get $1,500, next animation, I guess. Yep, there we go. In the sites where we offered the resources, it was 86% of the teachers that were there. So the comparison is we could have 25% of the teachers leaving, or we could have about 14% of the teachers. So meaning by offering the $1,500 incentive, we substantially cut down the likelihood that teachers were going to leave over that period by 11 percentage points. But we thought, this is interesting. This is actually a big and bigger effect than we had anticipated for $1,500. We wanted to see, was it driven by childcare? Was it driven by the schools? How did that look? So next animation, I'll show you. These were the control groups, so the centers that did not get offered the resources by whether they were a center or a school. So the first thing to note is that retention, or the likelihood of not turning over, is much higher in the schools. Nearly all teachers in the public schools stayed whether you offered them these resources or not. And you can recall they're getting paid much, much better. So basically the turnover problem is not a public school problem. It's a problem that is really salient in childcare centers, where there you could see about 30% of the teachers, when not offered these resources, left. And what happened, kind of the key finding of what happened with the incentive, next animation, is you can see that for childcare centers, this just had an extremely large impact. So whereas in sites that did not get the resources, 30% of teachers left, in those sites that did get offered the incentive, it was 15% of teachers, meaning we cut turnover in half just by offering those teachers $1,500 to stick around for that period. So we were really sort of surprised by the goal. I mean, on the one hand, you think, of course, this is a low-wage job, so offering more money should have an impact. But the fact that with a relatively small investment, we were able to have such a meaningful impact on stabilization was very striking, and allowed us to say, let's try to experiment with expanding the scope. What happens when we increase the amount of money and or target the programs in different ways? Next slide. So the key takeaway from the study was around the impact this has, not across the board for all teachers, but specifically in childcare where the wages are very low. And that allowed us to make a really strong case for the need to find more resources to expand this. This was a relatively small program when we started, just a test, just a pilot to see how well this works or doesn't work. But with this, we've been able to sort of expand the program so that in this year, it is going to be available to all teachers working in publicly funded childcare centers and family childcare homes. And rather than the $1,500, we're going to go to the $3,000 incentive, with the hope that we can really make a dent in the very persistent turnover and staffing challenges that we see. Next slide. You can see that in the past few years, the program has really grown. In that first year, the year we studied, about 1,700 teachers were involved, and this past year it was 6,300, grown even more in the current year. And similarly, the amount of dollars going into it has grown over time as we've tried to reach more and more teachers and ensure we are working towards stabilizing. And I won't talk a ton about this, but the other sort of major initiative Virginia has in place now is what Simon talked about around saying, okay, it's one thing to give these dollars directly to the teachers, but ultimately we would like the sites to be able to increase wages to a way that they're able to pay for the cost of quality themselves. That's been the goal of the increased subsidy reimbursement rates, where we say, okay, supposing we want to pay teachers enough so that they are able to stay at their sites and so that they are getting wages that support their needs, how much would that cost, and how do we start to ensure that that's available in these publicly funded sites? That started in October of this year. As Simon mentioned, we are just one of 3 communities doing this: New Mexico, DC, and Virginia. And it's pretty early to know the impact it has, but we have talked a lot to directors about the impact they think it will have. So we will come back to you around what it's actually doing. But talking to the directors on the next slide, you can see where we asked directors, do you think this is going to lead you to serve more kids on subsidies? The vast majority of sites said, yes, we think this will matter. We also asked sites that are not currently participating at all, do you think this will lead you to participate in this system and serve more kids? They agreed that it would. And our hope is to test and track in the coming year the extent to which these new rates lead both to subsidized sites serving more subsidized kids, more sites being willing to participate in the state system, drops in the turnover that I documented, as well as, ultimately improvements in children's learning and in families' ability to go to work. So those are sort of to come. And then last slide, just to wrap up. I think the key lessons we've taken from the work is that policies that are sort of compensation first and focused on the pay that teachers receive can have a big impact, not just on those teachers' lives, but on the lives of the families that rely on these services and the children who are going to those sites. It has been really exciting for me as a researcher to work with Virginia and to be able to sort of describe these 2 initiatives. We get asked all the time to go talk to other states about how they might implement things similar to Recognize B5 in the cost modeling, but doing these things well inherently requires a lot of money. Getting into the scope of them requires money. And so our focus has been around how do we get the scope of resources necessary in order to be able to fund, make public supports that address the kind of challenges that Simon laid out around helping sites being able to pay their teachers in a way that does not lead them to raise wages, raise prices so high for families that they are not able to pay for the services they provide. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions. There's a next slide. That is my email address if people have questions, and also the website for my team that has a ton of this data presented. Yes, or Elliot, you tell me.
You said publicly.
Sorry,
Sorry.
we need to have.
I didn't know you were back.
No, I'm sorry, and I'll get you the microphone.
I stuck my hand up faster. So I did a little math on you had the 6,000 some providers times $3,000. It's more like 19 million. So if you could address what that difference is, I'm missing. But then also, this came up in our group discussions. How do you get the money to the teachers?
Oh, that's a great question. So I will say it at a high level, and then Kathy's here because BCF does the hard work of actually getting the money to the teachers. Right now, the way we are doing it is we basically have built a data system, unique, I think, in the country, that allows us to track who all the early educators working are, and we track them over time to see who's employed, what are their characteristics, so we can sort of learn who's leaving, and also are they there over time. That's where how I got the turnover data. What VCF does, because they operate the Recognize B5 program, is they are the ones that are talking to the directors and tracking over time, is this teacher still employed at this site? And they're verifying employment over time. And, I say talking, but a lot of it is, we've built a kind of a data portal for sites to report this and verify the teacher's eligibility. And then it's checks coming from VCF directly to the teachers. That's really different from the subsidy reforms where the money is going to the childcare directors, and there the hope is that those new subsidy rates lead them to just have a bigger pool of money and be able to put into their payroll directly into teachers' checks these resources, if that answers your question.
That's coming through The General Assembly Fund?
It's come from a variety of resources. So when we started the program, what I tested in the first year, that was coming from the preschool development grant, which is federal dollars. Over time, because of the success of the program, that has sort of come back to the state to supplement those resources, expand those resources. And so it's a combination.
I was just wondering if it was taxed on either federal or state level that could make a difference.
So teachers are still taxed, and that's a good question. We wanted to make sure they were not sort of penalized for getting these resources and spent, but yes, those are tax dollars.
I was just curious about the definition for the public.
Yeah. So,
Publicly funded.
yeah, great question. So when I said there are these 4 publicly funded types of programs, they are all publicly funded, but in different ways. And so there is the pre-K programs that is funded similarly to K-12 public schools, whereas the childcare subsidies are funded, through basically vouchers to families to use. And so for family childcare homes and childcare centers, the way they're accessing public dollars is basically through a family applying, getting the vouchers and bringing them in.
This is sort of a naive question, but in looking at the slide about Virginia moving to a subsidy model that's based on the true cost, you might assume that we've got the solution, and now it's just a matter of time until sort of the market responds and finds an equilibrium where we can all sort of move on to other problems. So help us understand, or at least help me understand, like obviously we're celebrating that Virginia has moved to this true cost model and leading the nation, but I mean, implicitly more is needed. So can you just sort of help us understand, like,
yeah, totally.
Put that achievement in context, and what's left to do?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I mean, I think that fundamentally what moving to the new cost model did was get really real about how inadequate the way we had been funding up until this point was relative to what it costs to run these programs. And I think just to echo Simon's sort of point about the cost models, traditionally the way we would have done it is say, well, okay, this is we want to help these families access childcare. What do other childcare programs cost? That's going to be how we figure out rates. The problem is that the entire sector, not just the publicly funded ones or the ones that take these subsidies, they're all kind of undercharging relative to what it would cost to actually compensate the teachers. And what I mean by that is it is basically unheard of to have a child care center that pays teachers anywhere close to what a kindergarten teacher is getting paid or a pre-K teacher is getting paid. If you think that's a reasonable wage for a teacher of 4-year-olds in a school, why a teacher would be getting paid half that much in a childcare center is just really hard to connect the dots. And it is not surprising that when we pay that low, we see incredibly high sort of churn of teachers and teachers that are basically the problems we're seeing where we're not able to hire. So what the cost model did is, one, get really concrete about that and say, well, what would Virginia need to pay in order for our childcare sites to see more stability, and be very concrete about what that gap is. And then I think we've used the resources that have been available to try to cover a portion of that gap. And as Simon was saying, we are, no state is saying, okay, here's what that is, and we're at 100% of that, like we're able to fully cover that. So what we've done so far is make a big push relative to where we were to basically move closer to the true cost, but we're not at the full true cost. And we need sort of sustainable funds to do that longer term. And further, there's a lot of families and growing demand to participate in these programs. So more and more families want this. So as more families are seeking it out, how do we continue to grow that amount of money so that we are continually able to say, okay, now that this portion of Virginia workers or families are needing this, how do we meet that demand that families are showing while continuing to pay teachers at that level? Yeah.
There we go. On your slide where you were showing the subsidized versus unsubsidized wages, I noted that the subsidized had a lower average wage. Can you explain that?
Yeah, totally. So basically, if you imagine that you are a site that is relying totally on parents' pay for how you're funding your center, you charge whatever you're going to charge, and that is how you end up with the bulk of the resources, or maybe all the resources your site has, and then you can take those dollars and pass those on into wages for your teachers. In subsidized sites, they're doing the same thing, but often a portion of their kids, whether it's a quarter of their kids, half their kids, 3/4 of their kids, are getting the subsidy rather than the parents pay. And in most Virginia sites, what was happening is that what a parent would pay for childcare was considerably higher than what the subsidy was covering. So basically, the sites that would take the subsidies were losing money on every single child that was doing that. So when they got their pooled resources, what they were able to pay their teachers is then less. What the new rates are trying to do is not only make it so that the subsidy children are paying as much as the other children, it's actually saying, oh, those children, the ones whose parents are paying, they're not actually, I mean, they're paying enough from the perspective of what they can handle and what's reasonable to charge families, but is not enough for the pay of teachers. And so basically what the new rates are trying to do is say, let's pay those subsidy rates so that they are at the true cost of what it would cost to pay those teachers the rates that we're talking about. And that is why now the idea would be that if the subsidy kids are equal to those other kids or even better rates than what the families are paying, that creates a real incentive for sites to want to engage. So basically it's trying to make it feasible for sites to serve these families and also to just make it so that they can pay teachers what they want to pay them and what is necessary to not keep experiencing the churn.
Second question, if it's okay. What other factors were you considering in your data point where you were giving the $1,500 or not for people leaving? So were you doing anything else in the survey, or was it just simply looking at the $1,500, or were other factors considered on why people were leaving their positions?
Yeah, great question. So we collected data on a huge amount of things, and we've been interested in lots of factors other than the money itself, in the sense that there's like good leadership at their sites, there's professional development, there's benefits, there's all sorts of things that sites could do that would matter. But the nice thing about the experiment is that the only thing that was different between those two sites that was whether we offered those money, because we're basically saying, let's take all the sites in one large community in Virginia and randomly assign some of them to get this and some of them don't. The sites looked on average similar on everything else you could think would matter, like on benefits, on like the sites look very similar. So now the only difference about them because of the randomization is, did they get the special deal or didn't they? And that was the impact of what we calculated. But in other work outside of the experiment, we've been interested in all sorts of factors, and there are lots of things that make it better or worse for teachers to stay and make teachers more engaged. This just is the one that dominates. Like it is the main one. And I didn't note here, but when you asked the teachers, which we did, what did you do with these resources? Like what did this money do for you? The answers were all around sort of extremely basic needs: food, medical bills, paying down basic supports they needed. And so I think the compensation is just like a straight path towards stabilizing.
I wanted to tie just 2 points on the two questions together. I think the first is just to emphasize, Delegate Cherry, that the chart on the differences between the compensation was pre us making the changes in the methodology, right? And so we're right as we speak now doing another survey to understand, is there still that same delta between sites that take public subsidy and those that don't? And then to the question about what has occurred, we are in the process of measuring impact and compensation. But if you tie the implementation of the alternate methodology, which is the rates went into effect in October of 2022, were received by sites in November of 22, what we have seen and what we showed in our first commission meeting was still very significant growth in both the number of sites that are taking subsidy and the number of children that are being served. So there has been an almost immediate response from the private sector around developing more capacity to serve more kids. You know, there's still some rigmarole to get determined eligible, right? But we've gone from probably about 35,000 up to just over 42,000 now in that period. So that's the sort of the first level indicator. And then the second level indicator, which we're studying right now, is what is the actual effect on competitive compensation, and being able to kind of bring similar charts around comparing sites that take public funds to those that don't.
So we're running a tiny bit over, but we've got 2 questions in the queue that I want to clear out, and then we will move on to our next agenda item. One of the questions came from the chat, and it was, with data on teachers who've left their employer, do we have data on whether they've stayed in the field or left altogether?
That is a great question. So I can answer that in a couple of ways, but in our last couple of surveys, we have basically tried to find track not only the teachers who are staying, but also the teachers who are leaving. They're harder to find. Once you're no longer working in the childcare, your interest in our surveys maybe is not as high, but we have heard from lots of the leaving teachers. And on the whole, in Virginia, it's about a quarter of teachers who leave and say that they are still working in childcare or education jobs sort of outside of the publicly funded childcare system, but in other early childhood roles. There's about a quarter who say they have moved to other sectors or left the workforce altogether. And so it's a mix. I would say about 1 in 4 are continuing to work with young kids.
The piece of data that I was wondering about as we showed the wages was what's the educational attainment on those as well, if we could kind of find some of that information.
Differences in the education levels between over time or between the sectors?
School systems
Yeah,
versus
totally
the
different.
non-school
Actually,
systems.
that was in this presentation. We took it out for time because I talked too much, but so I'm happy to share that with you all. So in the public school system, it's basically 100% of the teachers are college educated teachers, which is a requirement for working in the pre-K system. In Head Start, it's close to half of teachers that have a bachelor's degree. You have lots of teachers with associate's degrees. And when you look in family childcare homes and childcare centers, it continues to go down from there as far as the average education of teachers. So that speaks to sort of the sorting. It speaks to the compensation levels and who is willing to do that work. I'll just note that we've looked a lot at that because that is a point of interest in many places and policies around the education levels of teachers. We haven't seen strong relationship between those education levels and measures of kind of the quality of care kids are experiencing in the site. So it's not the case that childcare centers whose teachers have higher degrees either leave less or have better interactions with their kids than the teachers with lower degrees, but it does sort of reflect the historic different rules and then different kind of incentives for teachers to work across these 2 sectors.
All right. Thank you so much, Daphne. That was great.
Thank you.
So let me now briefly introduce the home stretch because we are coming down to the final hour of our meeting. So the next thing you're going to do at your tables is talk about, again, we've been talking about levers, we've been talking about costs. It's now time to take those and put them in the context of what do you want the state to do, right? And make recommendations about action steps and priorities, because if we're going to draft up a report for your consideration at the next meeting, which we are, having that would be incredibly helpful. So in this next time period, talk at your tables and try to identify, again, sort of a manageable number of things that you would like to see the state do. And in this case, while we continue to welcome your sticky notes, there is going to be a report out. So please make sure there's someone at your table who's prepared to say a few words to the larger group. We will then try to synthesize that as best we can before we get public comment and wrap up. Before we go into small group conversation, I wanted to share a few things that we've distilled from the comments that you've been making all day, which are incredible in both their thoughtfulness and volume, so we can't cover all of it. But there are a few things that I thought were worth pulling out and sharing with the group for your consideration as we get into this last round of conversation. So there were a number of specific levers of change that folks brought up that hadn't been touched on specifically earlier that I thought were worth bringing up, particularly because some of these seem to come up multiple times. One is, and again, there were a couple that thought about how are we leveraging assets that might be available to us that we're not fully using. One thing that came up in that was insurance, right? Are there insurance support programs that could be used? Is there a way to do shared services for insurance for providers, right? That's a relatively major expense. Is there a way to somehow get those costs down? A couple of comments about leveraging Head Start, right? We haven't talked about it as much because it's a direct federal to local program, but it has come up. It is an important part of the early childhood context and the early childhood community. And how do we want to leverage that going forward? Rural development funds also came up. You've heard a number of times today about some of the special challenges in rural areas for childcare. Are there funds that are meant for rural development more generally that could be leveraged in service of the work that you're doing? One thing that a number of people brought up was the idea of simplification. How are we making it easier to understand what both sort of how the system is working and how do we make it easier for providers to access the system? A number of people referenced the barriers that providers face to being a part of the subsidy system. Are there ways to identify and address those barriers? And when you think about that, that's really an ongoing process, right? Like, because new barriers may emerge, barriers may evolve. So that was clearly something that was on multiple people's minds. One thing that a few people brought up is parental leave, right? And the idea that if parents have paid leave from work, they may not need childcare, and that if you're thinking about supply and demand, that has implications for it. So again, something that came up, which in some ways segues into one of the other things people brought up, which is what is the role of business and industry supporting the childcare workforce? Because obviously, as we talked about, businesses benefit from the availability of the workforce, and what is the right role for them in this conversation? Perhaps relatedly, there was a number of people who asked about space, right? And that if you need space for childcare, are there places where you might be able to repurpose existing underutilized space and make that available to childcare providers at some sort of discount or for free? And that, again, that's one other resource to consider. Another thing, a couple of other things that people talked about, the teacher pipeline obviously is critical, and how you get people into that. And then someone pointed out that, or one of the groups I think pointed out that there is potentially a need for broader public awareness about some of the things that you've learned about in the commission, presumably not to the level of detail you've learned about it, but at least to understand the basic importance of childcare and early education. There were also a number of questions that people asked that, again, I just want to flag. We're not going to try to answer them right this minute, but just so you know what your colleagues are thinking about. A few people asked about sort of the data and methodology underlying some of the work that Virginia has done, both in developing the cost model and in defining quality. Again, we're not going to go into that right now, but I think that the relevant staff would be happy to fill folks in if they have more curiosity about that. And a couple of questions about the definition of quality and the note that how policy defines quality and how parents define quality may not always line up perfectly, in part because parents may have various different definitions of quality, right? And different parents may appropriately be looking for different things. And then one group did say, right, that they really thought that their priority, this felt more like a priority, was to make sure that the state was funding the actual cost, right? Which again, the state has taken steps toward, but how, is that the thing that we want to make sure we're doing? Again, that's something for everyone to consider as you go into your group discussions, which you will now do. So again, all of us who've been talking at you and presenting and discussing with you will be around if you have any questions. But really what we'd like you to do in this next piece of time is to, as we turn the corner and head for home, is to say, what are the things that are most important for this group to be recommending? Kathy?
Thank you. It just occurred to me, it was so great to hear Simon's and Daphne's presentations and, really begin to understand about the importance of paying at cost of quality and really thinking about building the workforce. I think one other thing that hasn't really been mentioned but needs to be addressed is that we also need to think about the density and the sustainability of those dollars. And so if the subsidy, even at these higher rates, is through vouchers, that might be 5 children out of a whole center full of kids. And so we really need to think about how do we make sure that we're funding centers at enough density that it's covering the costs for all of the children who are being cared for. And providers also need some assurance that these dollars aren't just temporary, to really buy in and be able to kind of pay their staff more, expand their services, to get new operators interested in coming on board, knowing that this is sustainable revenue and not something that's going to be gone overnight. So just another aspect. It's great that Virginia is in this position and has this knowledge and this transparency, but it also needs to be at a volume that does the job.
Any other thoughts anyone wants to share before the groups break out? All right, we'll have at it, and we'll check in with you again in a little bit. But thank you to all of you who have stayed the course and participated in these small group discussions. Let us maybe go from left to right this time, just for simplicity's sake. Although actually, maybe Rebecca, could we have the online folks report out? Here, yeah, and be scrambling to designate a spokesperson if you haven't already. Oh, the folks online are still coming in. This group looks like pretty ready, right?
Okay, we had a few ideas. One of them was to see about Go Virginia grants to build supply for child care centers. One is to use churches for ECCE space and consider, there are some restrictions we hear on churches hosting child care centers that are subsidized by the state, and we should explore that further to see if it needs to be relaxed or what the true status of that is. When we have new development and new businesses coming into the Commonwealth, incentivize childcare spaces. Consider 529 accounts, which are for higher education in K through 12 now, allow those to be used for child care as well. Then we've had local referendums on portion of the sales tax for, I believe, for school construction, but consider extending that to early childhood as well. And then this is more of a footnote. Right now in the Code of Virginia, it says that 40% of the tax revenue from cannabis, which was estimated to be at hundreds of millions a year, would go to early childhood education for at-risk kids. Just to keep that in mind, that that's a potential source if that ever comes to fruition. And those were our ideas.
Yeah, actually, cannabis revenue was one of the ways Washington funded, the state of Washington funded it. They called it Pot for Tots, and it was actually apparently effective. Yellow table?
So our group, we'll start with the big ask. It's been said we can't fund childhood education the way we fund K-12, and the question is, why not? If we can show the ROI, and I know, spoiler alert, next month we're going to be talking a lot about return on investment, that it will save enough money, maybe we could fund it at that level. We too agreed with the making employer participation easy, incentivize their development of on-site quality childcare, encourage economic development through the subsidies as the business solves one of its critical needs, which is their workers to have quality childcare. Unlocking the capacity for current high-performing, high-demand centers that are full, because we all know in our communities which ones perform better than others, and those are the ones that have the waiting list. How do we unlock capacity in those ones that are already doing it well? In the study, it showed that education levels of staff many times drives the quality. How do we link those two through policy? So quality and education, funding the education for workers, making it easier to expand the high quality pool of people that are teachers, and echoing what the senator said, it's got to be easy. I know I ran a private Christian school. We did childcare subsidies for a while. We quit doing it because it became more cumbersome than it was worth. And so when I'm having to hire staff just to keep up with the regulations and things, that became too much. And we actually stopped taking the subsidy because it was easier just not to. So it's got to be easy. It's got to work.
All right, are the online folks ready yet? All right, let's do that next. What? Oh, does someone from the online group want to speak? Well, maybe chat amongst yourselves and we'll come back to you. Blue table?
We talked about some of the things that were mentioned. I think we weren't so bold as to go all the way where this table went. So thank you for doing that. We've really talked a lot about sustaining what we already have in place and building on it, assuming that the funding is not already baked into the budget. So this in terms of subsidy and mixed delivery, and then moving the scale up beyond where it is and moving it all closer, like moving subsidy closer to the cost of care where mixed delivery is set, increasing it up to 100% instead of 85%, moving mixed delivery qualification beyond the level that it is now. Talked about mechanisms that are already in place that could be utilized, like opportunity zones. How do you incentivize employers to kick in and participate? And things like they mentioned in terms of using pre-tax dollars for families to be able to support the cost of childcare.
So a lot of some of the things the other tables have said, also thinking through how do we financially pull this off? And in order to do that, we've got to quantify the gap. So a lot of our conversation was, what is really the true cost? And then what could we establish for that true cost rate? And let's say we want to strive to get to the true cost, but then establishing a rate or a percent of individual or household income toward that true cost. So on one of the slide decks earlier, it was 7% of an income shouldn't be spent more than 7% on the cost of care. So if we establish a 7% or a 10% and establish the true cost, what's the gap? Let's quantify the gap, and then let's decide the strategies to find where the resources are and the funding in order to close that gap. But establishing both of those is truly important.
All right, do we have a volunteer from online who's willing to speak up on behalf of that group's discussion?
Yeah, I will do so. I think the senator may be speaking as well, but this is Simon Fiscus. We kind of thought outside the box, if you will, because we know that a lot of staff don't leave just because of their pay. That's actually not the main reason why staff leave their jobs. So we just threw out some other ideas that have helped that. With our program, having a third person in the room has helped tremendously, which is a much lower paid person, but also helps an entry level into early childhood. Less workload overall, kind of as someone had mentioned before about making the process is more simple. Releasing the wage and hour regulations so that daycares and Head Starts alike can be exempt from those, along with the public school who already is, which does away with a lot of unemployment situation charges and requiring those staff that are off for a period of time to apply for other jobs. Educate our local governments to participate, how this is important to them, get them as a funding source. Same thing with the federal government. Virginia, go up to the federal government and tell them how important this is to us to increase those Head Start grant and early Head Start grants in particular. Virginia is doing great. The government overall has to weigh that with all 49 states. So get those all together. Serve the at-risk kids first. Try to equate federal and state funding. So look at that where the federal and state funding are different. Try to put those together because we're serving the same citizens, same at-risk child. And I think that's all we had unless the senator is available to talk as well.
I am here. And this is Mamie Locke, by the way. And we talked about if we truly want to build and sustain a system that's built on Virginia's values, then we need to determine what exactly that is. Specifically, if we truly value children and we value early childhood education, then we need to put our money where our mouths are. We need to prioritize children. We need to prioritize early childhood education. We need to prioritize teachers. There was a slide that was shown earlier that showed a teacher and said, then why do we pay this person fewer dollars than we pay anyone else, but we put this person before our children every day to teach these children? Then we need to prioritize that person. And even though Simon said that it's not always about money, but we need to also value that person and pay that person a salary that that individual is worth. And then we also talked about the fact that you hear these big dollars being thrown around about billions of dollars being a part of the budget process, and how that money is going to be spent at the end of the day. We need to rethink how we use those resources, and that it may not necessarily be about sending someone a $200 rebate check. Maybe we need to think about feeding kids with that $200 or paying teachers with that $200, as opposed to sending somebody a $200 rebate check.
All right. So thank you to all of you for those conversations. I feel like there's a few themes that came out, which I'll just try to reflect back in the hopes that those look even remotely what you think, like what you thought you were discussing. And so tell me if you think I'm wrong about this, but that, again, one of the themes that clearly was cutting across a few groups was the idea that the Commonwealth needs to start thinking of this as more of a public good, right? That there is benefit to children, families, employers, and that there are certain gaps that those families and employers are not in a position to close themselves, and thinking about what would this look like if we were really providing the service at the level that met the demand, and that gap is quantifiable and potentially closable, not overnight, but that over time it can be closed. And that in doing so, that would make the system more accessible to families. And that part of that would also, a couple of dimensions that definitely came out are, one, making sure that there's a workforce capable of doing that, right? And making sure that that's built into all the modeling of what it costs, which again, Virginia is well down the road to doing. One of the themes that hadn't come up previously that came up a few times today was the idea of space, right? That where these children and professionals are is something that also needs to be accounted for and is being accounted for, but that there may be more creative ways to get at that in the future and leverage available opportunities. In thinking about getting there, again, one of the other consistent sub-themes was that more resources are needed, but that there are also greater efficiencies that the system could realize. And are there ways to look at what are the regulatory burdens that are making it hard for providers to participate, and how do you address those on an ongoing basis to help build capacity? Those felt like some of the, as you think about the core of the system, that those pieces all really spoke to what it should look like. There were a number of additional and again, I'm doing that at the highest level, and there were a number of very good specific suggestions in all of those categories. There were a number of recommendations that fell more into the category of leveraging additional resources, right? That there's a recognition that there is core funding to support the early care and education system already in place that needs to be amped up, but there may be complementary strategies that can have an impact on how families are approaching their role, how private providers are approaching their role, and other kinds of public and private funding that could be leveraged, and that's also an issue worth exploring, which is probably related to the theme of public awareness, right? That if folks are going to participate in supporting this system, either through public funds or through incentivized private funds, they should have a better awareness of its importance. None of that was radically new, right? Like, again, this was meant to be a synthesis for you as well, for all of us, but that those really felt like sort of the core things that rose to the top. And as we think about the draft report that we're going to be bringing to you in September, those felt like the things that would likely be emphasized. Does that seem right to folks? Is there anyone who, again, like at a high thematic level, we're obviously going to have to go through the notes and write out in more detail, but at a high thematic level, does that sit well with people? I'm seeing some nodding, which is good. All right, good. So that gives us enough to get started with, which we will do. Before I hand it over to whoever's taking it in for public comment, any other last comments from members of the commission that they want to share on this, at the end of the second meeting? All right, great. Representative Cherry.
Thank you so much, Elliot, for all of your kind work today. Can we give him a round of applause? I think he's done a great job keeping us somewhat on task and pointed in the right direction. It's been awesome to see all you here today. Delegate Coiner started with opening remarks and said it was so nice to see so many on Zoom, less on Zoom and more in person. I disagree with that, since I was the one last month that was at the beach in Florida. And so, but it is great to be with you here today. When we reconvene in September, we will focus on cost and the return on investment. And I think this is somewhere where we can really make some good arguments on why, if we spend the dollars now, it will help us in the long run to save more money than we'll ever spend. And I think many times in Richmond, when we go to legislate and we go to look at budgeting in particular, we forget that part of it. We always look at the upfront dollars. We very rarely look at how much we can save on the backside if we'll spend the money well from the beginning. We'll be sharing findings from a study conducted by the Prenatal to 3 Policy Impact Center out of Vanderbilt University will be our primary thing we'll be looking at, and how those investments return in a short term, 1 year, midterm, 3 to 5, and then long-term investment of those dollars. And so I think it's going to be an awesome, awesome meeting. Please make sure that you put that on your calendar. And as we proceed to adjournment, I'd like to say thank you for each of you taking your time today to come out. I know this is a long slog of a meeting sometimes, but it's important. And we thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules and away from your daily walks in life to come and to be here. And again, thank you to Simon for your talk, and to Daphne for your talk. And again, thank you, Elliot, for facilitation. And with that, that adjourns our meeting for the day. Bless you. Be safe as you travel, and we'll see you next month.